All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Kim Waddell. I'm the project co-lead with Dr. Greg Warnell and Jeffrey Uema. We are the representing the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience Planning team here based at the University of the Virgin Islands over on St. Thomas. And today is day 2 of our three island focused workshops looking at planning for resilient Virgin Islands and looking at the role and opportunities for ecosystem services. And today we're focusing on St. John. So again, I appreciate your attendance, and I'll provide a few opening remarks, and then we'll, towards the end of my presentation, I will turn to the agenda and you can see what else we have lined up. So please, next slide, please. So as I mentioned, folks here at the university and elsewhere are working on the next hazard mitigation and resilience plan. And this is a slight variation from the hazard mitigation plans that have been done historically. And I'll speak to that shortly, but what we've done is added the term resilience, and that ends up playing a very important role both in the scope of our work as well as some of our outcomes and efforts. So every jurisdiction, whether it's a state, sometimes it's a county, sometimes it's a large city, has to maintain a up-to-date hazard mitigation plan for FEMA. It's a requirement. And it has to be updated every 5 years. The reason you want to keep it updated, aside from the obvious advantages of having a plan in place that hopefully, after disasters gets implemented, is that the FEMA then allows you to be eligible for funding for what we call pre or post mitigation, and this is done on an annual basis, and it allows communities to identify issues sometimes in their existing plan, but also thinking ahead to the types of disasters or issues that they might be facing. Most of this funding now is going into a new program called Building Resilient Infrastructure for Communities, BRIC, and that's a program that FEMA has launched over the last, I want to say 2 years, but certainly this year it's really stepping up. The recommendations in the hazard mitigation plan also allows for jurisdictions or communities to get funding from other agencies in the federal, from the federal resources. And then finally, and most importantly, having an active, engaged hazard mitigation plan hopefully creates, support from our communities in a way that helps plan for and prepare for both the recovery, resilience, and a number of risk reducing initiatives. And I think this is most important because the implementation of hazard mitigation plans is really where things get done or don't get done. And unfortunately, a lot of jurisdictions, ourselves included, have often had our hazard mitigation plans sit on shelves after they were signed off by the governor and by FEMA. Next slide, please. So we've, our hazard mitigation plan, resilience plan is actually fairly complex. And on the right side of the screen, you can see that we have, in the blue box there, we have both processes and outcomes that we're working for. And so things like what we're doing today falls into the stakeholder engagement, where we discuss with the communities issues of interest relevant to hazard mitigation and resilience. And for this particular workshop, we're looking at the natural resource sector. And all of that, along with the assessment and analysis of the hazards, environmental profiles, we do a risk assessment, all of that goes into the analysis and assessment process. And between that and the stakeholder engagement, that feeds into a body of work where we develop strategies and actually create a planning framework, which is one of our early outcomes. And then ultimately, policy recommendations feed into, again, with stakeholder engagement and, government input, et cetera, feeds into the eventual plan that is prepared. In our case, will be online and will be a dynamic, active document. And that will then go to the governor for signature, and then he and his the executive branch submits it to FEMA for final approval. Well, this kind of work, especially when you look at across the various sectors, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly, it just can't be done by one entity. And so we've turned to a variety of partners and collaborators. In particular for this workshop, our colleagues from Texas A&M Corpus Christi, the Hart Institute for Gulf of Mexico Research is our partner for today. But we've also turned to other universities and consultants with subject matter expertise. But all of this is really driven or focused through our perception and expectation of resilience, our research. It also affects our research and our understanding. And this is what we're using to sort of focus the planning process, is looking through a bit of a metaphor of the lens, resilience lens. Next slide, please. So one of the things we folded into the hazard mitigation plan, and we're actually one of the first jurisdictions to do it, which I find surprising, but maybe that's just because I'm a little too close to the topic. But climate change we're looking at the impacts of climate change, which is a slow, chronic stressor on all of our systems. But when it comes to the type of natural hazards that we face here in the territory, whether it's earthquakes, tsunamis, landslides, which we're well aware of, and of course our hurricanes that come potentially every year. But we're also seeing longer droughts, and again, these chronic, incremental, but never-ending issues like sea level rise. But we're also seeing warmer temperatures, and that sometimes exacerbates droughts. Sometimes that just creates public health challenges in our more urban areas or low-lying areas across the territory. But we're looking at all of these, and we realize that climate change is amplifying the intensity. Some people think it's also the frequency, but we really can't verify that. But it's definitely amplifying the intensity of the hazards that we face here in the territory. Next slide, please. So when we look at those natural hazards, we're then looking at spending an enormous amount of time looking at two major components of our society, our culture, our environment. One is the critical infrastructure on the left. This includes governance, our government's ability to do its job, the capabilities it has. We're looking at energy, transportation, and so forth. But it's, today we're focusing on natural systems. How do these hazards impact natural systems? And what does that mean for us here, whether it's around the quality of life or, our natural resources? On the right-hand side, you see essential services, and these are things that often the government is responsible for, but we all play a role. And whether it's around the economy, housing, education, and so forth. And agriculture, obviously, being part of our natural environment, even though it's managed, is also a key focus for today, or certainly this week. So all of this, the way we're looking at, through this lens of resilience, we're looking at all this critical infrastructure and essential services and how they operate, the operational and function and maintenance of these systems. We're looking at it through, again, this lens, and then the impacts of the hazards. And hopefully the recommendations that come out of this process will lead us to a more resilient Virgin Islands. Next slide, please. So what we've done so far, or we're still underway, it's a long list here, but as I mentioned, we're obviously laying the groundwork for the planning, and what's ahead definitely is the implementation of the recommendation. But we've been doing a lot of technical research and impacts, looking at impacts of climate change, hazards, and so forth on the essential services, the infrastructure, all there on the right-hand side. But we've been doing that through interviews, field work, data collection. We're also looking at root cause analysis. What's underlying some of the challenges that we see in the territory, whether it's the function or the maintenance of either systems or progress, or just the reliability of the services. We're taking advantage of workshops like this to do community outreach. This is just one of many ways. We obviously do knowledge sharing through webinars. We have op-ed pieces and so forth that come out in both radio PSAs as well as op-ed pieces in newspapers and so forth. So we've been quite busy, but when we look at the built environment, the natural environment, and the social cultural environment, those are the three foundations for what we think about for resilience. If you don't have all three, it's really difficult to say that you've got a resilient environment or a resilient way of life here in the territory. Next slide. So when we think about the resilience of natural systems, what are some of the issues and challenges that we face here or anywhere else, frankly? And so when we look at disasters and what are the risks that are either exacerbated or driven, even made worse, we look at things like the unplanned and rapid urbanization. And here in the territory, we don't have, for example, a comprehensive land and water use plan. And so consequently, we've had unplanned development or development that probably, with some hindsight, we probably wouldn't have put it there or allowed it to be there. But things like poverty, and income inequality, especially in St. John, but it's throughout the territory. These exacerbate the challenges and put more people at risk. And then obviously, as I mentioned before, climate change and the variability in our climate. I mean, like our droughts. I mean, we've had a pretty severe drought coming up to about a couple of weeks ago. Now we've had a seasonal amount of rain, at least here in St. Thomas. But, it could start drying out tomorrow and we could go another stretch. We just have so much variability and unpredictability around our climate right now. So some of the compounding factors include demographic change. Now, we know that after every major storm, historically, we see a dip in the population. We should get the 2020 census data here in the next few months, and we'll see if Irma and Maria, for example, drop our population. But, large drops or pulses, increases, can really affect our vulnerability or compound, the impact on our natural systems. The unsustainable use of our natural resources, whether it's overlogging, clearing of forest areas for development, overfishing, et cetera, or too many people on our beaches, all of these can create stressors and, again, lead to, we were talking earlier, to a tipping point, so to speak, where you get so far, degrade the system so far that it really can't recover. And this leads to, overall declining ecosystems, which obviously is important for our way of life and quality of life. But some of these other factors, the pandemics, economic shocks can also play major roles in negatively impacting our natural system. Next slide. So what our ultimate goal for the hazard mitigation plan is to, we want to have a series of recommendations that increase the robustness of systems and service delivery options. And so whether it's, having reliable telecommunication or electricity, or the roads are in good shape, to take people to and from work or to school, things like that. Can we increase the robustness? Can we, withstand minor and even major disruptions? This operations issue is very critical because FEMA is being stretched extensively through all the natural disasters that are impacting the mainland as well as the outlying areas like the territories here. And the kind of resources that they had in 2017, we really can't expect. And so that, coupled with the fact that they are asking for greater accountability and they have the technology to track their investments in post-recovery or response recovery era, they are going to hold us to a higher standard. If we're not maintaining and maintaining our operations and our resources that they invested in, there's a good chance that we will see a lot less funding or no funding for supporting that in future disasters. But we definitely have a capacity issue. This is a challenge throughout all small islands. And so the university is uniquely positioned to try and build capacity through training, but we also need to collaborate with the private sector, other governments, our own government, and foundations and so forth. And I think ultimately, and this goes back to the social cultural community resilience, if we can build a sense of ownership and identity at that Virgin Islands level and increase community cohesion because we have a shared sense of values or a shared sense of recognition of how important, whether it's our environment or our built infrastructure or what have you, we need that for the implementation part of the plan. And that's going to be essential to have this community cohesion. Next slide, please. So when we think about, what we're doing in this plan, as I mentioned early on, we had to turn to subject matter experts for help in these various sector analysis. And so for the natural resources, we turned to Texas A&M, as I mentioned earlier. And we tasked them with these 4 bullets, which are quite, sorry, it's quite wordy here, but ultimately they're helping us quantify and qualify the benefits we get from the natural environment, especially those benefits that pertain to natural or hazard mitigation and resiliency. We've also asked them to characterize land use patterns and how that impacts ecosystem, both the benefits, but also function. And looking for opportunities that we can recommend that actually target management efforts for the sustainable use of the resources here in the territory. They'll touch upon this a little bit today, this trade-off analysis, but they're sort of going to plant the seed, and I think hopefully we can pick this up, or the communities themselves on each island can pick this up or revisit this when we reach out to them again. But the idea is that we're looking at 1 or 2 sites on every island that we identify as a priority and see if there are options that we can pursue and identify in the planning effort. And then finally, this all builds up to providing recommendations for the territory, ways that we can strengthen the positive factors and enhance the resiliency of our ecosystems here in the territory. Next slide. So today, I just walked you through the welcome and introduction. And before I should ask my colleagues, Greg Winnell or others, if they want to add anything or if I skipped over anything before I work through the rest of the agenda. Okay. So our next on our agenda is we're going to have a keynote address by Rafe Boulon, a long-time, lifelong St. John resident who has a unique perspective, both because of his family history, but also his work with the National Park Service and many other organizations there in St. John. And he's going to basically provide some comments talking about the cultural and natural history of St. John. Then we're going to have an exercise, well, actually a number of speakers from Texas A&M who will sort of walk us through some of the basics of ecosystem service and how that connects to hazard mitigation. We'll take a break around 10:30, and then the case study trade-off, we're going to be looking at Coral Bay, and they'll lead that discussion. And then at the end, we will go into a community engagement and group discussion. And throughout the day or throughout the workshop here, please feel free to ask questions. I'm sure, we've built in a lot of time, especially for Rafe in the front end. So if we get a nice stimulating conversation dialogue going, that's great because that's going to feed into the work that we do later in the workshop. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Rafe Boulon. And you're muted, Rafe. You're muted.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Drs. Waddell and Gwinnell, for inviting me to do this. Yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the changes in perspectives and use of natural resources pretty much during my lifetime. I can't speak a whole great deal about it before that. So I'm going to primarily be talking about things since the early 50s. Just to give a quick background as to how I ended up being here. My great grandfather was chief meteorologist for the US Weather Bureau in the Caribbean. and he set up the Puerto Rico office in 1908. My grandmother grew up in Puerto Rico and met my grandfather there, and they subsequently bought, it's hard to believe, but they bought Trunk Bay in 1928. My father was born in Puerto Rico, but grew up at Trunk Bay, and my father, mother, and grandmother ran a guest house at Trunk Bay during the 40s and 50s. We ended up selling it to Rockefeller when he was buying up land for the park around 1957. I was born at Trunk Bay in 1952. I have a bachelor's degree in marine environmental science from the CVI, 1976. And I've got a master's in biological oceanography from the UPR, University of Puerto Rico, and then mostly working with deep coral reefs. And then I worked for Department of Planning and Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife for 18 years, doing a lot of endangered species, environmental education type work, a lot of research on natural systems here. And then I worked for the Virgin Islands National Park and Virgin Islands Coral Reef National Monument for 14 years as Chief of Resource Management and Science. So I was born pretty much right around the time when tourism really started taking off in St. John. At that time, there's really only Keneal Bay and Trunk Bay as guest houses, really no other formal accommodations on St. John for visitors, for tourists. And there were approximately 750 people on St. John at that time, quite different from the 5,000 or so plus umpteen number of visitors that we have right now. And the park was established shortly later, around 1957. At that time, in the early 50s, perceptions of natural resources were quite different from now. They were viewed primarily as unlimited, never going to done. I mean, never going to use them up. There was a great sharing of resources, a lot of bartering, trading, giving, you know, extra fish for fruit, eggs for meat, that sort of thing. A lot of that went on the island because there was such an abundance of everything. In the sea, fish, conch, whelk, lobster were extremely plentiful. They're easy to catch. You know, you catch them in fish traps just right off the shoreline. There was more than enough for everyone. And people really only took what they needed for themselves, for their family, and to barter. On land, St. John was mostly owned at that time in large tracts, post-emancipation, when freed peoples were either given or purchased land from the ex-plantation owners. And because they were in such large tracts and everybody knew each other, people were allowed to free-range livestock and grow fruit and produce. So people were allowed at that time to pretty much free-range livestock and grow produce on other people's lands, generally with some sort of agreement to share those things. Tourism really changed things. Suddenly there was a big demand for marine resources, fish, lobster, conch. More people got into the fishery to support this, and this was really the start of overexploitation of our marine resources, taking more than what was needed, more than what was capable of being taken. And suddenly there was a big demand for accommodations, transportation, restaurants, and all the other amenities that visitors wanted when they come here. People gradually transformed from a more agrarian lifestyle and living off of existing natural resources to being entrepreneurs and having to depend more on imports of food and other resources. And the establishment of the park changed things even more. The large tracts pre-park that were in private ownership were bought up by Lawrence Rockefeller and became part of the national park. People were no longer able to free-range livestock or grow food on other people's lands. And then restrictions were placed on what can and can't be done on park lands. People began to complain about the park, quote, taking the land, thus depriving them of the use of it. In actuality, parklands are owned by everybody. You're a US citizen, even if you're a visitor from another country, in some ways, you own the land. Everybody owns the land. And there are naturally restrictions that have to be put in place to protect the natural and cultural resources from the visitor use impacts. But there are still many fruits and natural products that can be harvested on parkland, including fish in the sea. There's just various restrictions in place on how you can do it. And the harsh reality is that if not for the park on St. John, every piece of land on St. John would be under private ownership. And given the current change to demographics that we've seen, it would have resulted in all of this land being off limit to everyone. And undoubtedly, nearly every beach on St. John would have a large resort on it. So even with the requirements under the Open Shorelines Act, how many St. John residents would really feel comfortable going to a large resort beach? Probably not too many. And as a park, all the beaches are available for everyone to go to. Yes, there's a fee at Trunk Bay, but you're paying for a lot of amenities there, and all that money goes back into improving the park infrastructure. When the Virgin Islands Coral Reef National Monument was created in 2001, the fishermen, the politicians, all claimed that their fishing grounds were being taken. However, an analysis of fishery landings from this area for over 20 years, as compiled by Virgin Islands Division of Fish and Wildlife from fishermen's own catch reports, show that only about 3% of all landings in the Northern Virgin Islands actually came from this area. Not highly significant. Over time, many fishermen have come around to accepting the benefits of marine protected areas. Primarily the fish do grow up in these areas, and then they move out of the marine protected areas and become available to the fishery. And this has been shown in a number of marine protected areas like in St. Lucia and Belize and other places. And when the local fishermen have seen videos and presentations by some fishermen from other areas, they've come to appreciate that maybe marine protected areas are the way to go, just not everywhere. Excuse me. Today, unfortunately, the story underwater is not pretty. Resources have become even more limited, with fishing pressures far exceeding sustainability. And the habitats that fishery resources need to meet their life history requirements have been stressed and degraded by too many people, basically loving them to death, and pollutants, diseases, and storm-related impacts. However, there is much greater awareness and acknowledgement of the finite nature of our natural resources and the stresses they're under. Hopefully, more and more people will come to the realization that protection is needed and do something about it. Regarding socioeconomic changes, we've also had huge houses built on private land within and around the park on St. John. And these are typically viewed as gateways to St. John as a rich man's playground. They don't fit into the character of St. John, and they very much don't include local St. Johnians, many of whom greatly resent this change to their island. And a final comment I'll make, with COVID and the neighboring islands in the Caribbean being closed to visitors, our American islands are being overrun with tourists. I'm sure we've all seen this, we're all aware of it. To resource awareness than pre-COVID visitors. In fact, the Department of Tourism statistics show a shift from an average age of around 60 of pre-COVID visitors to an average age of, I think it's 25 to 34 for current visitors. We now have hordes of younger tourists who are primarily here for the beaches and the bars, not the beauty and serenity of our island and our park. And local St. Johnians are not appreciative of this. Yes, some people are making money, the taxi drivers and others are making money in Airbnbs and a lot of the housing sector is making money off it, but it is stressing out St. John considerably. And we're all hoping that this will change when more islands open back up, because we need to get the character of our island back. So that's pretty much what I had to say right now. If there's questions, I'll be glad to answer any.
All right, well, thanks, Rafe. No, I think that was a unique but important perspective on the changes that you've seen. And as someone who moved here first in the mid-70s, I can relate to many of your comments, and certainly things like the land prices and what have you, especially on St. John, but throughout the Virgin Islands. But let's open it up to questions. I think Rafe posed a number of, I don't want to say controversial, but certainly pointed, comments around, for example, tourists, the nature of tourism, and my question is there a sustainable model of tourism that you could envision for St. John would be my question, but again, let's hear from others.
I have a question.
Well, the sustainable model would be 20 years ago.
Okay, but can we recapture that? Is there an opportunity to? I mean, I'm brainstorming here with you. I'm not saying there's a solution, but the idea is, how can we manage the influx or the nature of our tourism without being either discriminating in a negative way? Any ideas?
It is a big challenge being a U.S. territory. Under U.S. laws, we can't discriminate people. The national park here is just totally overwhelmed. They have 2 rangers on staff, hoping to have 3 soon. And the resources are being impacted daily. I got into a very nasty confrontation with a tourist at Trunk Bay whose kids were throwing rocks at the seagulls on Trunk Bay Key, which is a nesting colony. And he was about to attack my wife and I, and literally attack us. Just horrible. And we backed off. But, there's just this sort of thing goes on every day right now in St. John. And it's a very different quality of tourists that we have here right now. And we're really hoping that when things open back up and people start getting on their cruise ships again and going to other places, that maybe they won't be coming to St. John. We'll get back to, the older, more reasonable type of tourists that have been coming here for years and years and years and have felt unsafe traveling during this time of COVID. Whereas the younger generation, a lot of the younger generation feels safe. They don't feel that they have to worry about it as much, and they do travel more. So maybe we'll see. We're hoping it'll swing back the other way.
Okay. So Mary, go ahead, Mary.
I think Rafe, don't you think it starts with education through tourism? That we educate people to what St. John represents. It represents a natural environment. It represents community. And you talk about the older generation who's been coming here for years. They've been bringing their families, and their families now come, and their families now come. And I see a lot of that. And I think it's up to a community to start asking better questions of our tourism department. And how do we rebrand and remarket St. John? Like we have such an opportunity now with Keneal, with the Virgin Islands Environmental Resource Station. Why couldn't that be set up like a health center, through the University of the Virgin Islands, using the nursing department, using the environmental department to take Keneal and set it up as a world-class health environment for training. We've really got a lot of opportunities here as a community to take those values that we all know why people came to St. John in the first place. We don't have the campgrounds like we used to anymore. And that kind of environmental tourist isn't being marketed to anymore. So I guess my question is, how do we engage the tourism department for St. John and the Virgin Islands?
I'd like to.
I agree 100%.
Go ahead, Sharon.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Rafe is saying about the current conditions of tourism and the over-tourism. And I think it certainly is being caused by the COVID era. And then there's a secondary thing that is causing it, which is the Airbnb, all kinds of automated online booking situations, which aren't set up to easily allow you to, frankly, as an owner, they intentionally do not want you to screen the people for their suitability in terms of you as the owner or manager. They want you to click and take the credit card. And that's an issue. And because, and this relates to non-discrimination and stuff like that nationally. But this is a problem if you're trying to control if you're trying to say this person is a good match in terms of what they want for their vacation to come stay in my accommodation and so forth. That is being screened out by the online applications, frankly, right now. It's a problem. The other thing is that the kinds of people that I'm hearing from property managers are here today, and the conflicts that we're seeing in Coral Bay constantly between the values of the people who live here and the values of the tourists who are coming, is that, as Rafe said, we're getting the people who chose sun and beach on other places where they market to come and do whatever you want. It's like what you do in Vegas stays in Vegas. It's the same attitude. And there are a number of other islands and cruise ships that market to that kind of attitude that are not available right now. So I am with Rafe in hoping that we see when things open back up again, sort of an automatic diminution of some of it. But I think this has provided us, from the comprehensive land use planning standpoint, a real opportunity to see what over-tourism is on St. John, and to figure out, as part of the comprehensive land use plan, what we do to have a sustainable level in the future. We have now seen over-tourism 100 times. And we've seen all the conflicts that it's generating amongst the people who live here year round and the people coming in the way that things are. We've also seen the environmental degradation and so forth going on ocean. So I hope we can use this as an opportunity for the future planning. Thank you, Ray, for putting together all those thoughts.
Well, thank you, Sharon. I think
Thank you, Sharon.
I think it's a sensitive issue around, who do we want to see here and who don't we want to see here? I mean, when you think of the legacies, across the nation, but even here in the Virgin Islands, whether it's around race or economic status, this is a highly sensitized issue. And I think we have to be both careful. I think Mary mentioned, education. Is there an opportunity for us to provide, guests, visitors, some information about, what makes St. John special, or what makes it, so serene, or, whatever you want to capture, but start communicating that. And then I guess the second part of my question is, our land prices so exorbitant that we can't, for example, recreate Maho Bay and increase ecotourism, or was it Concordia? I mean, start using some of the available land to sort of try and strike that balance, to return to that. And then, is there value in having a large hotel, versus the Airbnb, where, to your point, you can't really screen them to the same degree a hotel might, whether it's economic or otherwise. So, yeah, that's a general question to everybody, but great for anyone.
Yeah, I agree. We need to change our marketing for St. John, really, and for the Virgin Islands, but for St. John, because it is different from the other two islands in many ways. Each island has its own uniqueness, but we, like as Mary was saying, we really need to get the tourism department to spend some time on rebranding or branding St. John to try to attract the type of tourists that we want here, and not focus on the, Maho Crossroads and various other nonsense like that that so many people are coming here for right now. So it's, I think it's really, and the other big issue with tourism are the vehicles. Our roads are not on St. John, are sub National Highway standards, and we don't have parking everywhere. The national park is a national park, not a national parking lot. And So there's just continual issues with too many vehicles. So an alternate transportation plan, some other way to get people to the beaches, into the park without their vehicles. And unfortunately now everybody wants to have their own vehicle. And now they can be brought from St. Thomas, either, you know, people staying over here, renting them at the airport and bring them over here, or coming over for the day. We have hundreds of cars coming every day. I mean, not hundreds, but lots and lots of cars coming every day from St. Thomas just as day trippers. And where do they park? You know, where do they put their vehicle when they're trying to go to the beach? And then most of them just totally ignore the fact that the parking lot's full, and they go out and they wedge their car into some piece of vegetation, which over time, you know, becomes a bigger and bigger parking area. And then more and more, you've got the sides of the roads being taken up by parked cars and sticking out in the road, and it's a nightmare. So anyway, there's lots of issues.
I'd like to add to that the long-term view that people on St. John have, that St. Thomas wants to make money off St. John. And certainly we have many incidents that the people who make money off of St. John development are St. Thomians. And so that makes it hard. There's a lot more of them, and they vote. And what happens is that we also have a perception, therefore, generally speaking, that the governor and the executive branch is entirely focused on economic development. And St. John is an easy sell, they think, to off-island money willing to invest in the Virgin Islands. And so we end up with the highest level government support for things like a mega yacht marina in Coral Bay, for things like big hotels, big condo complexes, and other kinds of things on St. John. And as long as that is the case, the things we're talking about are going to be very hard to take precedence in terms of the long-term development.
All right, other comments, questions?
Well, I saw a comment scroll across the bottom about
Yeah, let's see what's in the chat room. Hold on.
About not all being belligerent. I certainly agree with that. I mean, yes, a large majority of the visitors here are very nice people. They're enjoying being here. They love being here. They're appreciating being here. But there's just enough of the other ones to sort of taint the whole batch in some ways. So it's that segment that we really don't want. But anyway, how to get them to go somewhere else is a good question.
Yeah. So maybe Sharon or anybody can speak to it. What's the status of the Coral Bay Marina?
I'd be happy to speak to that. It's
Okay.
in the Army. It is still in the Army Corps process. It is, which means it's actually with NOAA in their endangered species and things. Even if everybody wanted to have this marina, which clearly almost no one in Coral Bay or St. John does, it would still be 4, 5, 6 years into the future. It is, however, very unlikely to gain the federal government permission to do this. Something that most people probably don't know, because I am not aware that it's made the newspapers, but the big Amano Lago tourism development in St. Croix off Frederickstead. I don't know if you've discussed this. Believe it or not, the developers of that, who started in 2009 with local CZM permission, are still trying to get Army Corps and federal government permission, and the Army Corps has told them that they will not get permission for the mega yacht marina that they wanted to put in there. they will be denied if they continue to pursue it. And I think exactly the same thing will happen with the Army Corps if the people behind the mega yacht marina for Coral Bay decide to continue to pursue it. What this has done though, no, the mega yacht marina will not happen in Coral Bay. Should it get approved, there is a national environmental law firm that is ready to do a pro bono legal challenge to it. So it has a lot of community and other backing for not having it happen. However, that doesn't mean that it is not being promoted by both our legislature and our governor constantly. And that's just an honest fact. And I would just add one more thing to that, which is the negative local impact of that being in permitting since 2014, when it takes at least 10 years to get a marina permitted, even if everybody wants it. But the negative of having that land, the land under the control of the marina, is that the local families who own that land cannot develop it in a reasonable way for their own current income and for services that the Coral Bay community would really like to have, and for reasonable sized tourism. It's been a terrible drag on local scale development. Thank you.
Well, so speaking of that, I mean, as we all know, or maybe some of the audience doesn't know, that the national park owns the majority of the land on St. John. So with limited land, is there a scale for sustainable, progressive, environmentally sensitive growth in such limited areas? I mean, for example, is there a marina that could be put into Coral Bay that would get local buy-in? I mean, if it's, whether it's larger boats, smaller boats, or different, is there a model, an alternative model that would get local support, I guess is what I'm asking.
I think there is.
I think there would be.
Mhm.
Go ahead, Rafe.
Go ahead, Sharon.
No,
I just said, I think
don't-
there is at a smaller scale and in the right location.
Okay. Sharon?
I agree. I think it's well beyond the scope of what we can do today. But yes, those kinds of issues we've been talking and asking ourselves, and we actually, the Coral Bay Community Council and others have some good ideas for this. But and I welcome discussion at some other time.
Okay. All right. Let's see if there's any. So I think and I've alluded to this because I want to raise the issue of values, because I mean, right out of the gate, Rafe and Sharon and others, you share values of a way that you'd like to see St. John, whether it's the type of tourist or a way of life. And I think, Rafe, you've acknowledged that that maybe that's in our rearview mirror. We're never going to see that again. And so, are there other values? I mean, you talk about the governor, pushing growth and development. And, one of the things that in our work here, we've recognized that without economic resiliency, really all these other resiliencies really take a back seat. I mean, they really don't have the support. I mean, if the government doesn't have the resources to maintain the infrastructure or keep pace with the needs, that's why we have a brain drain. That's why, we have all these challenges of capacity, because the infrastructure, both the built and, available housing and things like that, are simply not here. And so, we're really challenged by trying to figure out what values, what approaches can we, adopt or adapt to that allows for the kind of growth and the kind of opportunity that all Virgin Islands of all races, economic, blah, 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 can, be proud of, and yet doesn't, destroy or degrade the cultural identities, whether it's of each island or of long-standing ancestral groups that have been here in the territory. I mean, this is it's a sensitive issue, and I just think, you know, the values issue drives that. I mean, both nationally and in this conversation.
I'd like to address that, if I could, from the remote rural perspective of Coral Bay.
Okay.
We found that our community was fairly resilient through the recession, because most of our businesses were family owned and run. Therefore, they could retract, and the family members took a greater role in running the businesses, honestly, and getting them through the downturn of the recession. We saw the same thing after the hurricanes, is that what got Coral Bay up and running again was the fact that there was family investment, frankly, from all over the place, all over the US and other parts of the world too, that was coming in and helping to get things going again, plus a lot of new local entrepreneurial starts after the hurricane, taking advantage of the fact that there was work that needed to be done, and that they could go to. What we still have as a real difficulty in terms of resiliency, and the driver is lack of communications in Coral Bay. If the whole south side, which we call it, which is the western portion of Coral Bay, is very limited in the cell service that they have and in the Wi-Fi applications, and this includes the affordable housing community and other long-term Native communities. And so they are being, by the fact that we still don't have commercial today, 5 years after it's 4 years after Irma, we don't have the promised resiliency day to day in communications, the cellular landline and internet. That hampers any of those people from going into the kinds of entrepreneurial businesses that we're talking about, even if they've got the investment potential to do it. So I think that we have felt that on St. John, and particularly in Coral Bay, which is an island on the other side of the national park, that it's very necessary to have resiliency that is locally based, as well as depending very much on the rest on the territory and the federal government to assist us with that. But the lack of communications and getting that communications infrastructure up, and of course the electricity, is a real problem in achieving what you're suggesting.
Okay. Rafe, any additional comments or thoughts on that point?
Well, just a clarification, the park actually owns about 60% of St. John, so there's still a fair amount of St. John outside the park. It's broken up a bit, but yeah, but Coral Bay has a lot of needs, and it can be addressed, I think, through various types of development that take into account the local landowners, what people need out there, more of an eco-tourism based approach to all of it. And like with Keneal Bay, we have a great opportunity there, hopefully, for some real development that would take into account ecotourism, training, community services, museums, shelters, whatever. There's a lot that could be done in a place like Keneal Bay. So hopefully we'll see what happens there. But I haven't given up hope for St. John whatsoever. So.
Well, good. No, I think we're finding a lot of value in your comments and thoughts, and I think the optimism has to be there. It's such an amazing place. We're actually winding down on our time for this session. I think at 10 o'clock, we're turning it over to our colleagues at Heart Institute who are going to lead the next part of our discussion. But is there one last question or anyone else? I know there's some questions or comments in the chat room, and we might revisit some of those when we get into the discussion later in the day. But let's go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you, Ray, for your comments, and
Thank you.
Mary and Sharon in particular. Also, I think you raised some important perspectives that people need to hear. All right, let me turn it over to Christine.
Thank you, Kim. I think we're going to get started with Dr. David Yaskowitz's presentation at this time.
Okay.
No worries.
So so Dr. David Yaskowitz is the Senior Executive Director for the Heart Institute. He's also a longtime colleague and friend of mine. We worked together on things like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill a good decade, 12 years ago, and I'm excited to have him present today. I'll turn it over to him.
Good morning. I'm David Yaskowitz. I'm the Senior Executive Director of the Heart Research Institute and Endowed Chair for Socioeconomics at Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi. Looking forward this morning to talking to you about planning for a resilient USVI and the role that ecosystem services can play. So one thing that we do know is that change is constant, and especially around climate change. Many of us in our own lifetimes have seen significant change, the results of changing water cycles, intensity of storms, etc. This animation over the last 100 years or so shows the change in average temperature during that time period. As is demonstrated here, the warmer the bars, the greater amount over the average temperatures. And so you can see in that last 100 years that we are having higher temperature averages than earlier on. And this is no surprise to any of us. But the results of that increase in temperature and the frequency of that increase in temperature is creating this new normal. So in the extreme heat events are more frequent, and we all have experienced this. That has the tendency to drive other hazards. So a warming climate happens to increase in some areas, rainfall, given change in weather patterns. And so what we've seen over the last 50 years or so, as demonstrated by this meteorological data from a number of different sources, as increasing temperature has seen an increase in the rise of the number of floods. Now, I must caution here that this isn't accounting also for the number or the increase in population that has found itself in more flood-prone areas. But we also see an increase of extreme weather beyond just flooding. Okay, more intensive storms, obviously more intensive flooding, and more significant droughts. That the average that we all used to talk about is really now just the point between two extremes, where we go from extreme drought to extreme wet or flood conditions. And those have really significant impacts. And that the increase in population, along with the increase in hazards, whether it be flood, storm, wind damage, drought, tornadoes, etc., now we are putting more humans in harm's way. And so you can see since 1980 here on this bar graph that we find ourselves in increasing economic risk because of the way we build and where we build with increasing populations. And so on this graphic, and provided by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, these billion-dollar disasters have increased in frequency as time has gone on. And in 2020, around the world, this has had significant impact on individuals and communities and cities in terms of displacing individuals as a result of natural disasters. And in 2020, it was estimated that over 30 million people were displaced because of natural disasters, 14 million of that from flooding and 32,000 from drought. In the United States alone, including the US Virgin Islands, 1.7 million individuals are displaced because of natural disasters. So what can we take away from this and be thinking about our connection to the natural environment, to natural habitats, and how they might be able to mitigate and create resilience? So hazard mitigation, in the definition that we want to use here, is the process of taking measures to minimize and potentially eliminate the impact of hazards on communities, infrastructure, and natural resources. Whereas resilience is the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and to withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. So how can we begin to mitigate impacts from flooding, extreme storm events, drought, etc.? Well, one of the things we can begin to think about is how we connect the natural environment to the human environment and the role that the natural environment plays for mitigation and resilience. So ecosystem services have been defined in many ways, but it most basically is that direct and indirect contributions from the natural environment or from ecosystems that help support, sustain, and enrich human life. And typically we have had divided up ecosystem services in four really major categories. So the cultural services, what we call provisioning services, such as food, fiber, the regulating services, and these are the services that are provided that help regulate Earth system processes that are really important to you and I as human beings. A big thing might be such as carbon sequestration or the lack of it, unfortunately. Also nutrient cycling, etc. And then support services that are things such as pollination. That's extremely important in, for example, crop production. So those are those direct and indirect values that we get from the natural environment. And then we have a whole other category that I don't want to spend a lot of time on, but a little bit more technical in terms of how we think about this as economists, are these non-use or passive use values. And so things that just the existence of the ecosystem in a pristine state is really important. And we want that to be around to be able to have our children and grandchildren enjoy that. So that's a bequest value that we get from a pristine natural environment. So really, if you think about it, ecosystem services can happen really anywhere that there's this interaction and this benefit that between the natural environment and human well-beings. And so ecosystem services are really demand driven. And what I mean by that is that you could have always the potential supply from the natural environment to provide these benefits, but they have to be demanded for the actual service to take place or to occur. As I said, they can occur on the landward side or the seaward side and in the margins in between. As I mentioned earlier, some examples of ecosystem services are nutrient processing for supportive service, primary reduction, hydrological cycle, regulating services, a lot of the processes that can control ecosystems, provisioning services, raw material, and the cultural services, which a lot of us are very familiar with, but are very difficult to maybe value, are things such as recreation, aesthetics, science and education, and cultural, spiritual, and historic significance. But demonstrating the value can be challenging. It can be done in monetary terms, right? Dollar, pounds, gold, bullion, whatever makes sense. But we can also value the benefits from our natural environment in non-monetary terms, such as just easy ranking. Does it make us feel good? Does it make us feel bad? Whatever it may be. So I think the point here is that value can be demonstrated in many different ways, and the way that you demonstrate that value should be the most appropriate for what you're trying to achieve. Right? So if we look at the U.S. Virgin Islands from the ridge to the reef, and this is something that I've worked on in trying to, how do we connect that natural environment to those constituents of well-being that emanate from ecosystem services? And so we take the habitats themselves. So in the U.S. Virgin Islands, let's think about this in terms of a ridge to reef and all the habitats that are in between there. And so those habitats have this biophysical functioning, right? What they do, whether it be, the forests, the mangroves, the reefs, et cetera, they function in a certain way. But as part of a bigger system, there's this ecological functioning that takes place with the other habitats or species around it, such as creating a spawning nursery, nutrient cycling, that interaction between abiotic and biotic, gas exchange, etc. And it's that ecological function that then leads into the many different ecosystem services that we talked about before. And it's the experience of those benefits or those ecosystem services that then creates this well-being in us as individuals or communities. And so it's a well-functioning ecosystem that provides these benefits that leads to things such as this personal security, material being that, livelihoods and food and shelter, the health aspects, the social relations, etc. So the benefits from the natural environment, which we call ecosystem services, are those things that affect our well-being eventually. And so in the Virgin Islands, as well as elsewhere around the world, we've seen some significant changes since, in just the last couple of decades, right? Big part of this is land use changes. And those changes have then affected the habitats, which then have affected the provision of ecosystem services that could potentially, in what we're talking about today, have mitigating factors against the hazards that are a result of climate change, and therefore can lead potentially to less resilience. And so being able to demonstrate and talk about the benefits connected to the natural environment, the services that we get from that, within this frame of hazard mitigation and resilience is critical in helping us to make decisions about what we need to protect, restore, conserve for hazard mitigation and resilience. And then in the world that we live in, which is of scarce resources, right? We have to be able to make some decisions about trade-offs. And so being able to identify those benefits or services that are most important for certain types of mitigation, ecosystem services helps us in that. And we'll be talking a lot about that today.
Thank you, David. I think we'll wait to hold off on questions until we've heard from the rest of the speakers, and we'll have hopefully a little bit of time at the end. So Christine, who is next?
Next up, we have Mr. Dijani LaPlace, and he's going to be talking about habitats in St. John.
Great, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dijani LaPlace. I'm a research assistant with the Hart Research Institute at Texas A&M Corpus Christi, and today I'll be giving a brief overview of some of the habitats in St. John and some of the ecosystem services that they provide. But first, let's look at these land use maps. So pictured here is a land use map of St. John in 1985 on the left and 2018 in the right. So just right off the bat, you can tell there's been significant changes in areas of development here in Cruz Bay and also in Coral Bay that are now highlighted by these purple circles. Development here being represented by a red color, where low intensity development is pink, just regular red is medium intensity, and then a darker shade of red is high intensity development. The forest interior area of St. John has not changed much from this forest being this green color here. That's due to this part of the island and 2/3 of it being a part of the Virgin Islands National Park and being federally protected. Also, the island interior is pretty hilly, so it's hard to develop on it. So this is a time lapse that shows the change in land use over time on 4 different time periods. From 1985, of course, which we saw previously, 1992, 2004, and 2018. So you can see, again, if you look at the Cruz Bay area and the Coral Bay area, that Cruz Bay, which already had some low intensity development, became more medium and high intensity as the years went on. And Coral Bay, that was a little bit more rural and had more shrubs and some houses scattered around, came more low to medium intensity development. So naturally, Source St. John, the first habitat that we'll be speaking about are forests. So in the USVI, the major types of forests found here are subtropical dry and subtropical moist forests. In St. John, the forest cover takes up about 81.6% of the island according to a USDA report in 2014. And that in acres is 9,830. Now the forests here on St. John, they provide a variety of ecosystem services, some being that they sequester carbon by incorporating CO2 into their biomass. And this helps to mitigate the effects of climate change since we put a lot of carbon in the atmosphere from our regular day-to-day activities. They also prevent soil erosion and sediment runoff by trapping soil in between their roots. Forests on St. John are also a major habitat for many terrestrial animals and also in the territory. So some of these animals may include bats, birds, insects, some reptiles, and of course, some other mammals, and in St. John that are commonly found around the park, deer. So this is the land use map. This is just a map of the forests rather on St. John, showing some of the major roads here shown in these yellow lines, the development again, of course, and then the forested interior, using data from 2018. So you can tell that in the forest interior, there has not been a lot of major changes, but there still is some evidence of fragmentation of these forests due to these roads cutting through for people to go from Cruz Bay to Coral Bay and vice versa. Now, although the fragmentation is not that significant, still is some fragmentation here and some sparse development around the Virgin Islands National Park area. And this could decrease the quality of the forests that we have. And by decreasing the quality of these forests, we decrease the ecosystem services that they provide. Now, a closely associated habitat with forests are guts. Now, guts in the territory were historically used for domestic, agricultural, and industrial purposes. Guts also provide a habitat for some of these organisms that move between some of these urban areas, since a lot of our guts here on the island actually cut through a lot of urban areas, and they also are a major food source for some of them. Guts also provide recreational opportunities such as hiking and nature walks. And historically, guts influenced the placement of buildings, since guts were one of the only sources of fresh water on these islands due to the topography and also being surrounded by salt water. Guts still also influence our building today, since the Virgin Islands National Code dictates that development can't occur within 30 feet from the center of a watercourse and 25 feet from its edge. Researchers at UVI and other places also use guts as a living laboratory for science and education. And they also have opportunities for potential master students to do some of their coursework there in these guts. Now, this is a map of the guts in St. John, the guts being the blue lines, and it also has a lot of other features included. So here we have St. John's major roads again, and the dark gray circles are the Waste Management Authority bin sites. And then the gray areas that are around some of the guts are the riverine flood zones that are associated with them. Now, from the map, we can tell that there are a lot of Waste Management Authority bin sites in the Cruz Bay area, which is the most highly populated on the island. And then there are some scattered around, some being in Coral Bay, and on some others around the east end. Now, there are not many gut intersections with roads here on St. John, and none are depicted here. But because of Cruz Bay's impervious surfaces, since it's so developed, improperly disposed garbage can still get into our guts from roads and also from around these waste bins and get into our guts and carry pollution to these marine areas. Also, pollution just in roads from general, such as some sediment and other pollutants like oil that may spill on these roads, can also get in our guts and then negatively impact the gut ecosystem and then go further downstream and negatively impact our marine ecosystems. Moving closer to the coast, we'll now focus on wetlands. So our wetlands provide a variety of ecosystem services. Wetlands here being salt ponds, salt flats, mangroves, and also freshwater ponds. One of the major ecosystem services that mangroves provide is that they help trap sediment and build up the shoreline and beaches by trapping soil between their crop roots. Salt ponds and freshwater ponds that are near the coast also catch some of the runoff that may come from downhill and trap and filter it, preventing it from going straight into the marine ecosystem. Wetlands such as mangroves also reduce wave energy and mitigate the impact of storm surge from storms. Mangroves and other trees that are associated with some of our wetlands in the territory also help to sequester carbon and mitigate the effects of climate change. Mangroves are also culturally significant and historically significant. Mangroves were not mangroves, wetlands rather. Wetlands have been used as major sources of water, particularly freshwater ponds, for some small-scale subsistence farming, and salt ponds have been used as an area where you could harvest salt. So on St. John, Salt Pond in St. John was used for this, Salt Pond being the name of the salt pond, ironically. Now this map just shows some of the wetlands that are existing in St. John. This data is from 2018. So you see you have some wetlands scattered around the national park area and some over here at Coral Bay. Wetlands being depicted here in the cyan color. Now, a lot of our wetlands were negatively impacted by the hurricanes and storm surge. And to model some storm surge damage the National Weather Service created the SLOSH, storm surge model, SLOSH being sea, lakes, and overland effects of storm surge from hurricanes. So this model here is for the storm surge that could be expected from a hypothetical Category 4 hurricane. So the blue color is for storm surge inundation that will be up to 3 feet above ground, the yellow being 3 feet and above, orange being greater than 6 feet and above, and then the red being greater than 9 feet and above. So on the first image on the left, you can see that some of the wetlands along Cinnamon Bay, Maho Bay, and Leinster Bay would get some significant inundation from storm surge up to 3 feet and above. On the right, you can see that Rendezvous Bay, Fish Bay, and Reef Bay over here, some of these wetlands will also get some storm surge inundation up to 3 feet above ground. So this would explain why some of the mangroves and wetlands were so significantly impacted by the storms that we had in 2017, which were both Category 5s. Moving now into the marine ecosystem directly, we'll talk about coral reefs. So coral reefs provide a variety of ecosystem services, some being just the straight up economic value that we get from them. Coral reefs are supporters of high biodiversity. They're used as foraging spots, they're used as spawning spots, and also just nurseries for young fish. And this helps the fishing industry since it gives fishermen the opportunity to catch a lot of fish and bring in some money for their families. And because of the biodiversity that surrounds these reefs, they also are pretty good for tourism because they're aesthetically pleasing to look at by tourists. Coral reefs also provide coastal protection, and by buffering against the effects of wave action, they break up the waves that come on shore before they actually get to the beach, and hence decreasing their energy. Coral reefs have always been historically and culturally important to the people of the US Virgin Islands. They've always been here hand in hand. And coral reefs still provide recreational opportunities for locals, such as snorkeling and diving. Now, this is just a map showing some of the St. John coral reefs. This is data taken from 2017. Coral reefs here being depicted in this purple color. So you can see that a lot of the coral reefs are located on the north shore of the island, and then some are around Coral Bay. Now here, we have a map that is showing land runoff on St. John and the exposure of land runoff, especially in our marine areas. Now, corals in the territory are already under the impact from a number of stressors, some that are common, such as thermal stress that we all know from climate change and global warming, and also recently one real popular one has been disease. Now, runoff is something that we might not be able to eliminate completely, but we can mitigate it. And runoff in Coral Bay area, which is pretty high, as seen here in this orange color, has been a problem for a while now. So if we could help to at least reduce some of the runoff that we have in this area, we could reduce one of the anthropogenic stressors that we have on coral reefs. And hence, maybe we could help them to be a little bit more resilient and recover faster from other stresses that they experience.
All right, well, thank you, Dijani. Our next speaker is Christopher McDonald, and before I turn it over to him, I just want to acknowledge that both Dijani and Christopher are recent UVI graduates, and we're really excited to have them working on this project. Christopher is working on a hazard mitigation plan, and they're gaining a lot of interesting skills that hopefully he can apply to either his professional development or his, further on in his graduate studies. Meanwhile, Dijani has been working with Texas A&M, and we hope to see him potentially attend grad school there, but that's just a plug from one of his mentors. Anyway, let me turn it over to Christopher and take it away, Christopher.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm very grateful to be the last speaker because the previous presenters really paved the way for my presentation. And today I'll be talking to you about the agriculture ecosystem. So the agriculture ecosystem, like Mr. Yaskowitz said, an ecosystem is a direct and indirect contributions that help support, sustain, and enrich human life. And with agriculture here in the USVI, it does that because it provides food for the economy. The agriculture supports the USVI economy. It also provides food security. In other words, different studies of how the crops are being processed and identified, and also with soil quality. The images below, if you're not familiar with our farmers market here in the US Virgin Islands, the images give you an idea of what the farmer market looks like, the different process and transactions that take place, as well as the different crops that are grown locally here in the US Virgin Islands. These crops consist of cabbage. You have your vegetables that consist of cabbage, carrots, celery, cucumbers, eggplant, green beans. You also have your field crops such as potatoes, you have sugarcane, hay, and you also have your fruit trees such as your pineapples, mangoes, avocados, and most importantly, coconuts. And in the image below that you see, this is an example of the different things that are sold at the farmers market. Not only do you have the idea of local crops, but you have local farmers that sell a variety of things, such as you have different seeds for different crops, as well as local hot sauce. And you also have in the following photos that you have a variety of plants that you could purchase locally right there at the farmers market. Not only do you have crops, but you have the opportunity to have livestock here, especially in the US Virgin Islands. And to give you an example of the livestock that is here, you have cattle, sheep, lambs, goats, chicken, turkeys, ducks, and geese. And all this information is based on the 2018 census for the Department of Ag. And the images to your left, you notice that you have an example of the livestock as well as how they're being taken care of. Just one example in the US Virgin Islands. So this image here gives you an idea of United States Virgin Islands prime farmland. For the individuals who are not familiar with prime farmland is a term that is used in which it's the best combination of physical and chemical characteristics for producing food, feed, forage, fiber, and oil crops. Basically, this is an overview of the locations of prime farmland. And in shorter terms, prime farmland is the areas that are best known to have the best conditions for growing a variety of crops. And you notice that here in St. Thomas, you have specific areas, which I highlighted here. So if you look at the specific areas in St. Thomas, you see that there is prime farmland as well as St. John, and then vice versa for St. Croix. But specifically in St. John, you notice that prime farmland is identified throughout the island, but majority in Cruz Bay, and then you have areas in Coral Bay as well. Based on the prime farmland, one of the things that we wanted to compare is to see the areas of prime farmland in comparison with development. Based on the development, we took the files of developed open space, high intensity, and medium intensity, and merged them into one file and compared them with the prime farmland area that you see that you saw previously. This is based on a 1985 classification, and you notice that in St. Thomas, you see a nice mustard yellow, which means that is undeveloped for prime farmland, and the red is developed. And then vice versa, you notice that in St. John in 1985, majority of the island is a nice mustard yellow, which is undeveloped. And then vice versa in St. Croix, since St. Croix is bigger, you see that majority of the island is undeveloped. But over time, in 1992, we noticed that specific areas have become developed. Specifically in St. John, we see Cruz Bay. in St. Croix, we see that the north variety of the island has been developed in the prime farmland area. And then we also noticed this in St. Thomas as well. But when we move forward to 2004 and we highlight specific areas again, we notice that the development, specifically in St. Thomas, we notice that majority of the prime farmland has decreased and vice versa for St. John. And then we notice that St. Croix prime farmland has also decreased due to the development in the various parts of the island. And then based on our last classification with our 2018 data, we noticed that prime farmland, specifically in St. Croix, has tremendously decreased due to development throughout the islands. And then you see, when it comes to comparison with St. Thomas, you see majority of it has been developed and specific areas are still undeveloped. Well, this is based on the 2018 data. And then we see it vice versa in St. John as well. And in closing with this talk, agriculture is reliant on the ecosystem services because it provides food to our USVI economy. But also when it comes to agriculture, it provides a variety of things, such as different research opportunities, such as the information that you saw previously. That was a soil survey that was conducted by the United States Department of Agriculture, and which they were able to identify areas of prime farmland, or in other words, identify areas that had the best growing conditions in the US Virgin Islands. And one of the things that we wanted to do with this talk is just to identify the development of the prime farmlands, so from 1985 to 2018, to show the listeners which areas in St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix have been decreased by development. And based on this soil survey, the purpose of the soil survey was basically to assist with planning decisions moving forward and used for identifying the best areas for farming in the US Virgin Islands. So thank you for listening to my talk. If anyone has any questions, feel free to contact me at christopher.mcdonald@uvi.edu. And thank you so much for coming on for our wonderful workshop this morning.
All right, thank you, Christopher. We're a little over schedule, or I think it's 10:35, 10:36. I'd like to have the Hart Institute team take some questions, but we're cutting into our break. And so maybe we can do 5 minutes of questions or 3 minutes of questions, and then maybe have a 5-minute break, and then we can come back shortly thereafter. Let's open it up for questions. Anyone or comments? Yes, Mary.
How do we get more working with the National Park Service and the local community to liaison into creating different uses on the park property, particularly those who are people who have land holdings on their properties. I saw a very interesting thing happen after Irma, because I live above a pond, and I observed that the pond opened up. This is Mondal Pond over by Salt Pond.
Sure.
It opened up to the sea, and fish came in. And that spring, the bird life was phenomenal. I had no idea what kind of fish came in there, but I mean, there was a flock of 30 great white egrets that flew up and down the pond. I mean, flamingos came that summer, 7 of them came that summer. Then the next year when we had the drought and it dried up, the fish died and they all came up to the surface, and they were tarpon that were about 1 foot long. So then I met some people who on the vineyard had worked with their local government and opened up a lot of their ponds to the sea, creating more a aviary sanctuary. And it really, just added to the whole environmental health of their whole, of the bay, of everything. And so with Mondal Pond, I think, how could we keep that open, have that water continually, that pond continually flushing, and create more of that kind of a environment?
Well, as far as I think I'd turn to someone like Rafe to speak to, what the National Park Service policies are on some of these things. But my understanding is that, we let nature take its course. I mean, hurricanes often breach, coastal ponds, salt ponds. Big Pond over in St. Croix, for example, opened up. And the same kind of phenomena, there was a flushing, new fish came in and all that. But I don't think there's any requirement to sort of close it up or open it up with any frequency, that's geared towards, again, our desire to see more bird life, or, just from the fish perspective, they don't want to be trapped in there, But
Well,
so it's a point of view is all I'm saying. But Grace,
Yes,
I don't know if you could speak to that, just as far as what the policy is for the park, and just what's the normal practice for these kind of natural events.
Well, yeah, the ponds typically do that. I mean, ponds typically do that when we have large rain events. They will breach to the sea, and then while they're open, fish will move in, and then they do close up naturally over time. And it's a profusion of birds, and then the birds feeding on the dead fish. The pond water quality goes down, gets too saline for the fish to survive. But the pond is really for reducing trapping sediment that comes off the island into the sea. I mean, they're a natural sediment trapping system to protect the coral reefs and the quality of our water near shore. So to open up a pond sort of permanently is eliminating that very important feature of our salt ponds. So it's a transient event. It happens. It's nice, for bird watchers while it happens, but then the natural cycle, it closes back up again, and certainly the national park is not going to alter that natural cycle by opening up ponds permanently and letting the sediment go into the sea. So I understand, but it's all part of the natural process.
As I understood it, what they did up in the vineyard was they had put a pipe, and it went up and down with the waters, and allowed fish to come in and go out, and fish to come in and go out. But of course, they don't have the same coral issues as we do. So anyway, thanks,
Yeah.
Ray.
All right.
Okay. All right.
Any other questions or comments before we take a break? I'm not seeing any. So in the chat room, my colleague Kelly Harrigan posted, this is a plug for VI Score, which is the other hat that I wear as director. We have our annual conference coming up on July 15th and 16th. And there's a link to register there in the chat room. So those of you who are interested in understanding more about ridge to reef phenomena, which touches upon many of the issues that we've been talking about today, please tune in and meet our researchers and our students, as well as understand more about what we're going to be doing over the next 4 or 5 years. So this commercial now ends, and we are going to break. It is 10:43. Let's come back at 10:48. Thank you, everyone. It is 10:48, and that alarm clock was notifying folks that we are resuming. Let me just check one last time if there were any questions from the last session that people didn't get a chance to ask. Okay, I don't see anything in the chat specific, and then unfortunately Rafe had to leave our meeting. He's been waiting for contractors to get to his house, and for the holidays this past week, it's been a bit of a challenge. Anyway, so coming up next, we're going to have Christine Hill lead discussion, basically looking at a trade-off exercise focusing on Coral Bay. And so without further, well, let me just make a plug for Christine as the very first graduate of the Masters in Marine and Environmental Studies out of UVI over a decade ago. We'll just leave it at that. Anyway, we're really proud of her. I've been able to track her career, you know, over the years. She also worked on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and has actually had several visits here to the Virgin Islands since then, but we're really excited to have her back visiting. And as it turns out, I actually live in her old apartment here on St. Thomas, which was just mind-blowing, given how many places there are to live and the fact that our lives keep intersecting that way. But anyway, enough personal stuff. Go ahead, Chris, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I just want to say a quick hello and thanks for having us. We're about to jump into a pre-recorded talk, but of course, I am here in the chat box, as is my colleague Kara and the rest of the team, if you have any questions as we go forward. Thanks so much, Michael. Take it away.
Good day and welcome back from our break. My name is Chris Hale and I'm going to be walking us through another segment of our workshop where we introduce you to ecosystem service logic model frameworks. So far today, we have discussed that given land use changes over time, as well as climate change impacts, ecosystem services are changing too. Therefore, the well-being benefits that we receive from the ridge to reef ecosystem are changing as well. I'd like to dive in a little deeper on well-being and using examples relate mitigation activities to well-being and how we can navigate decision-making related to changing ecosystems. So, how should Virgin Island communities deal with these changes? We know we can take preparedness measures like installing disaster warning systems, purchasing radio communications equipment, or participating in emergency response and recovery training. But preparedness is different from mitigation. Mitigation is the process of taking action to minimize and potentially eliminate the impact of hazards on communities, infrastructure, and natural resources. Now, there are many different hazard mitigation approaches that individuals and communities can take. And if you're like me, you can easily get lost down a rabbit hole when learning about all the mitigation options at our disposal. Thankfully, FEMA has made it easier on us by grouping mitigation activities into these 4 general categories: local planning and regulations, structure and infrastructure projects, natural systems protection, and education and awareness programs. I'd like to be clear that I am not a hazard mitigation expert. In fact, we may have some of those experts in our workshop today, but I point you to these examples of general actions that affect ecosystems. Given our theme for today's workshop, I especially want to focus on actions or management decisions concerning natural systems. This will help us understand the relationship between our actions concerning the Virgin Islands environment and well-being outcomes in terms of resilience. So, in general, the term trade-off involves losing one quality or aspect of something in return for gaining another quality or aspect. In terms of ecosystem services, a trade-off is a situation where the use of one ecosystem service directly decreases the benefits supplied for another. A trade-off could occur in the same place or in a different place. For example, the impact of the management of an upland forest on local recreation as well as on downstream water quality. There are also trade-offs between the present and future use of an ecosystem service. For example, over-harvesting of fish stock now will have ramifications in the future. A synergy is a situation where the use of one ecosystem service directly increases the benefits supplied by another service. For example, the protection of coral reef areas impacts fish abundance, which increases algal grazing and thus protects the coral, which eventually enhances recreation opportunities. So, given all of the potential trade-offs and synergies, how do we manage our natural resources so that we are maximizing the benefits that we receive? What are the trade-offs and where can we synergize? One way we can consider our many options is by utilizing a framework such as ecosystem service logic models. These models represent the way a management action cascades through an ecological system and results in ecosystem services and human well-being impacts. Logic models are a great tool to compare strategies across locations to match likely outcomes with stakeholder goals. Additionally, evidence that accompanies these models can be used to clarify uncertainties that need to be considered and to identify critical research gaps. If standardized, these models can provide a consistent platform for multiple hazard mitigation approaches and help increase monitoring efficiency. We are presenting this framework to you as one of the many decision-making approaches, and although the logic model development can get complex rather quickly, you'll see this in a few more slides, I use it to simply demonstrate the many well-being outcomes, or more specifically, the socioeconomic outcomes that can result when a community places the local ecosystem at the heart of the decision-making process. So let's start by talking about outcomes. Through research and application, we know that some outcomes of restoration are associated with resilience. For example, increased economic activity in a particular community through jobs, labor, and income allow that community to be more resilient to external shocks that harm the community. Additionally, when people in the community are employed, they enjoy greater levels of economic resilience and are able to respond better to unexpected shocks. Also, diverse job markets are known to be more resilient because the community does not depend on just one industry. In terms of costs, damage to property is a direct reflection of structural resilience, and repair costs for property damage link to the property owner's economic resilience. Increased spending at businesses in a particular community allow that community to be more resilient to external shocks. If spending takes place at businesses outside of the target community, then this may not affect local resilience. The ability for shoreline property to withstand external stressors like flooding and erosion represents a facet of structural resilience. Increases in property value can be linked to an individual household's economic resilience, and at a larger scale, increases in a community's property values, which can lead to a larger tax base, can be linked to economic resilience at the community level. Additionally, community members' health and associated capabilities are essential to resilience. A healthy community is better able to respond to and cope with external shocks. When community members gain increased knowledge and understanding of their environment in the context of threats to resilience, this can help spur increased public support for future similar restoration projects that would add to resilience. Strengthened or maintained cultural values can be linked to community ties and increase social capital, which in turn lead to increased social resilience. Critical facilities like hospitals, schools, government buildings are important for our community's ability to respond to hazardous events. Therefore, changes in their closure rate impact a community's resilience. So, each of these are specific outcomes that result from making change to an ecosystem, such as restoration, that are associated with resilience. I'm going to show you in our next slides where some of these outcomes relate to hazard mitigation. So here's just one example of a fully developed ecosystem service logic model that my team developed with partners for a previous project. I know it looks like a tangled and chaotic mess, but don't worry too much about what each of these boxes says right now. I simply want to point out the main ideas. We'll break it down into simpler, more digestible logic chains using some local examples in just a minute. So, what are we looking at here? This model shows a management action or intervention. So down here in the key, if you want to follow along. So on the left is the dark blue box. The intervention here is creating new or restoring existing mangrove forest. So this is one example of a natural systems approach to hazard mitigation. The arrows, that action, the arrows connect that action to the many effects it has on different components of the ecological system, seen here as gray boxes. These are then connected by additional lines to the human outcomes or human activities, seen as light blue boxes. Those human activities then result in socioeconomic outcomes, seen on the far right as yellow boxes. It is important to note that these ecosystem service logic models have been validated by peer-reviewed science, as well as experts in their respective fields. So these lines reflect literature, reports, science in general, to show that these connections are substantial, in a long term or over a short term. Additionally, key pathways to strongly linked socioeconomic outcomes are identified or indicated with bold arrows and outlines around immediate components. So the more bold, the stronger the connections. And with the yellow outcomes, the bright yellow or bold yellow indicates strongly linked socioeconomic outcomes, whereas the weaker or paler yellow color are weakly linked socioeconomic outcomes. So I know that's a lot of information, a lot to look at and absorb. Let's look at a few simpler logic chains using a local place as reference. So, after spending some time with subject matter experts over the past couple months, our project team selected Coral Bay as a place to focus our example. I know Coral Bay is huge and there's a lot going on here. Also, I won't spend too much time describing Coral Bay to you, as I'm sure many of you are actually local to St. John, hopefully. But for those that are joining us from other places, here's a quick description that I pulled from some helpful websites listed there, as well as from feedback we gathered from subject matter experts and supplemented by my own experience of this beautiful area. So, Coral Bay Harbor is located on the southeastern shore of the island of St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands. St. John is the smallest of the three Virgin Islands, or the three main Virgin Islands, and has had far less development than its sister islands of St. Croix and St. Thomas. This is largely due to the fact that almost 2/3 of the entire island is contained within the Virgin Islands National Park and is totally protected from development activities. Coral Bay was the center of St. John's plantation life in the early 18th century and eventually became the commercial center of the east end of St. John for centuries. But nowadays, other than very limited agriculture and tourism, there really are no other substantial commercial activities in the area. Most people either work in the tourism industry or are self-employed as artisans, builders, tradespeople, or they work in Cruz Bay or on St. Thomas. Coral Bay is regarded as the other town on St. John. It's opposite the relatively bustling Cruz Bay. Many of the residents are sailors who live on their boats in Coral Bay Harbor. Others are landlubbers living up in the hills overlooking the sea. There are resident donkeys, goats, roosters, and mongoose, and many Coral Bay residents like the rural and quiet lifestyle that the area provides. However, recently there have been some major development projects that some community members oppose. Additionally, Coral Bay continues to experience drainage issues. There are opposing views about development in the area, for improved economic opportunities and maintaining the natural systems for continued quiet nature-based lifestyles. Thus, some management action outcomes that could potentially be important to community members of Coral Bay are, in general terms, cultural values, human health, and economic activity. So, again, as a very simple example, let's consider the action, the management action of building and restoring nature trails and boardwalks in Coral Bay as just one approach of many to achieving these types of socioeconomic outcomes. So, as we move along with installation of our trails and boardwalks, once it's complete, it shouldn't be a surprise that people will begin to use these trails and boardwalks. So recreational activity would result as an expected human activity outcome as seen in the blue. So in this example, we didn't see much change in the intermediate components, which is where you often see ecological changes. But we went straight from building the trails to recreation, which makes sense. And also, it makes sense that as a result of these human activities, the socioeconomic outcomes of cultural values could be expected. In particular, knowledge of the area, especially of the natural ecosystems, would increase, as would potentially sense of place or existence values and other forms of traditional and ecological and cultural value. As I explained earlier, when community members gain increased knowledge and understanding of their environment, this can help spur increased public support for future similar restoration projects that would add to resilience. Now, let's see what this simple chain looks like in the context of a larger, more complex ecosystem service logic model with the same management action. So here is a model we created with our partners from a previous project. This is a fully developed ecosystem service logic model for trail and boardwalk installation. And here you can see the multiple pathways connecting the newly restored or built trails to changes in the ecosystem, to human activity, and resulting in outcomes that the Coral Bay community may or may not be interested in. There are other pathways of interest here, such as the connection to aesthetics, which is strongly linked to property value. Additionally, for those community members that are interested in economic outcomes and jobs, there's a strong connection between building trails and the economic activity related to the project itself. So following this line, building the trails strongly linked to economic activity of the restoration action. In other words, building trails brings more jobs in and of itself. I must note that this model was not created for Coral Bay specifically. It was created for another project, but again, it's a good example framework that we can use to think about trade-offs and synergies in terms of ecosystem services and choosing hazard mitigation approaches for a resilient future. Another management action that is considered a hazard mitigation activity is that of native forest restoration. So I'm not going to step through like I did last one, but just show it to you all at once. So native forest restoration may be an attractive option for some Coral Bay community members. Again, starting on the left and moving through the logic chain, we can see that when we restore the native trees, we see changes in the intermediate components, the gray boxes. In this case, plant species composition, species populations, biodiversity. These changes in the ecosystem lead to changes in recreational activities. These recreational activities can then lead to the socioeconomic outcomes of economic activity, cultural values, and human health. Again, this is but a simple logic chain, but it allows us to raise important questions that will aid us in making decisions, such as what kind of plants or trees should we replant? Will planting natives have any undesirable effects that we haven't thought about? What kind of recreational activities are related to changes in biodiversity? Can we monitor these changes both ecologically and socioeconomically so that we can adapt our community development or restoration plans going forward? So I'll stop there with our examples so that we can switch over to our discussion session where we'll be prompting you to think about what your values are in regards to ecosystems and how you think your community should or could move forward with hazard mitigation, ultimately for improved resilience.
All right. Thank you, Chris. I'm sure that this has stimulated some questions or ideas or reactions. I'd like to open it up first, and then I think we'll transition to the actual exercises and surveys in a minute. I just want to make sure we have a chance to field questions. Anyone? All right. I am not. Either wave, go on camera and wave at me, or raise your hand using the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. All right, well then let's move on.
Great, thanks, Kim. Let me share my screen here. Give us 1 second. All right, so what we're looking at here is a online polling software called Mentimeter.com. And what we're going to do is walk through a set of questions, but basically what you're looking at is our first question, but you'll note at the top of the screen that you need to go to menti.com. You can use either the computer that you're on or your phone or whatever device that you might be joining us from. Go to menti.com and enter the code that you see there at the top of the screen. And to make it easier, I think Kara or somebody else might be throwing that into the chat box so you can directly link to it as well. I'll give everyone a moment to do that. All right. So once you get into this poll, the first question relates to those outcomes we discussed earlier in my presentation. So I'd like for you to rank the human well-being outcomes that you think decision makers should prioritize for your St. John Island community. And we'll give you a few minutes to work through that and think through it and enter your responses there. Okay, you can see on the screen perhaps there's one person that's entered their responses so far, and we'll continue to add to that as more people submit their rankings.
So Chris, how many respondents have we had so far?
So far we've got 9.
Okay.
And I can't see how many folks are online currently, but we'll give it, now we've got 12. So there's still some coming in. There's a little bit of a lag. And I want to note too that for some reason, I don't know why, there's supposed to be an 8th option that says cultural values on there.
Oh.
So it's not in there, but that should be part of the decision as well. We can follow up with discussion about that in a minute. Yeah, so there's a comment from, I think, Brian, no emotional/psychological health option. That actually is captured in human health. So human health would capture the mental, the physical, the spiritual, multiple facets of human health. But of course, this is, just for the sake of example, if we were to be doing this for a real decision-making process, there'd be a lot more options that were more specific, like what you're pointing out, Brian, is, if there's psychological well-being that's, at the top of the list for you, that would be a motivating factor for some of the choices we would be making.
Yeah, and I think something like, quality of life, which I think, on each island has a particular meaning and yet considerable overlap. Embraces obviously the health component, but also, environmental protection, cultural values. So some of them are fairly broad, but yeah, quality of life for me is in the human health piece, but that's just because of the nature of the other choices.
There's another question here of Sharon. Does this cover aesthetics, views, etc.? Yes, quality of life needs to be here. Yeah, I would push back and say that all of these interact together to produce a quality of life, but no, not one of these options represents aesthetics particularly, but these are outcomes from actions that affect aesthetics, of course. So again, for the sake of example, we had to limit how many options we could give you guys using mentimeter.com. So, if aesthetics was, at the top of your list and we were doing this in a real planning process, we'd make that option available. We've got 14 responses so far. We'll wait another minute before moving on to our next question. All right, I don't think anyone else is entering, so we're going to move on. But before we do, does anybody want to, raise their hand or chat or take themselves off mute and comment on any of the choices here that they made, or why not? They may have ranked certain things a certain way. Yesterday, we also had property value at the bottom of the list when we did this with the St. Thomas community. And we discussed that quite a bit because property value might not be as high up on that list. A lot of folks rent, right? So maybe they're not as concerned with things related to property value because they don't own the land per se, they're renting from an owner. So that might contribute to some of the reasoning behind that. Whereas property protection, of course, is further up on the list because whether you're owning or not, you still want to protect your home and your way of life. Is anybody raising their hand or commenting? Let me see.
It's interesting that you mentioned property protection. I expanded that to environmental protection, just thinking, not just because I'm a renter, but I mean, it's a way of just, having a healthy, vibrant ecosystem around me is absolutely essential. And yet, I'm not thinking of, guard dogs or gated communities, but it'd be interesting if other folks took that differently than you just stated, Chris, because I might have ranked that a little bit lower from a, I mean, not to undermine or to devalue safety, but that's, to me, that's separate from property protection.
Right. In the pre-recorded presentation I gave earlier, and in the general understanding of how property protection is related to resilience, it actually has a lot more to do with erosion control and flooding. Right, but that is directly related to the ecosystem. So of course, if you have more trees and bush on your property, you're thereby protecting your own well-being from those erosion and flooding effects.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the next question.
While you're doing that, Sharon asked, are these human well-being outcomes as stated, or are these inputs? I'm not sure what you mean, Sharon. I don't know if you could articulate that a bit. If you're speaking, you're on mute.
I guess I'll just jump in and say, Sharon, these are outcomes, human well-being outcomes of actions that you could take. You know, we've been talking about natural systems protection, conservation, restoration ideas here as examples of hazard mitigation activities. So that question was more related to the outcomes of those actions. So the next question, what habitat do you value as most important for hazard mitigation and resilience? And here you're going to type your answer directly into the poll. It's great that we've got some more specific responses here. Again, the habitats that Dijani reviewed earlier and Christopher introduced us to land use as well is not obviously comprehensive. We grouped some of those habitats generally for ease of communicating on today's brief workshop. There's plenty of different types of habitats that we could focus on and get very specific when we make these land use decisions. So we've got 10 responses so far.
So Sharon says she's having trouble getting on, but she's able to put something in the chat. So I'm a little, I don't know how you, not sure if she's having trouble with the.
I think our folks here in the conference room are going to shoot her a direct link to see if that works.
All right, great, thank you.
Yeah. And just so you all know, we will be utilizing this feedback in our final report. We're not going to be providing identities of individuals. Of course, protecting your identities is important to us, but we will be taking these general responses and commenting on them in our report as ideas moving forward based on stakeholder feedback. We'll wait another minute before moving on to our next question. I'm happy to see that whole watershed idea there. 16 response, 17 responses, great. Hopefully Sharon was able to get on. $18.
Mary, are you raising your hand or you can't make? Maybe she's, I don't know. Yes, she's fine.
Okay, we are going to move on to our next question. All right. If you had to pick one, which type of mitigation activity do you feel would benefit your island community the most? Again, these are just limited to what we talked about today, you know, acknowledging that there's many different types of mitigation activities. But we're going to use this feedback again to create scenarios for our final report. Looks like we've got native forest / plant restoration and the tide for wetland restoration at the moment. And of course, wetlands includes all different types, salt ponds, mangroves, etc.
Okay, I think Kim,
Yeah.
Christine just lost connection.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I guess we could fill in for her really fast.
All right.
Oh, okay, wait, she's back.
Panic. I thought we had at least one more question, and so anyway, if she's back on, that's great. There we go.
I'm back on. Hopefully you guys can hear and see me. I don't know. It just dropped
Yes.
the signal. Okay. Yeah, this was actually the last question of this portion of the session. We're going to, in a second, move on to Dijani, who's going to get some more feedback from you all regarding community engagement. But before we move to Dijani, I want to give an opportunity for folks to comment, ask questions, maybe share why they chose these mitigation activities as they did, or any of the other choices that they made. So feel free once again to use the little emojis to signal your interest in saying something, or chat in the box.
Well, before I weigh in, I'd like to definitely give a chance for the folks on St. John to provide rationale for their selection before I provide my non-native perspective. So. Well, okay, I as someone who is looking at ridge to reef here in the next, the current EPSCoR research capacity building grant, we're definitely examining, the runoff through our, ephemeral guts and riverine systems, what's coming off the land. And in St. John, erosion is probably the single, biggest challenge. And so obviously if we, protect or manage our forests and ground cover, that would go a long ways to address what actually enters into the marine system, whether it's sediment or pollutants or what have you. That being said, if we work to restore our mangroves in particular, which is actually one of the focus areas of the EPSCoR award that runs till 2025, we are looking at ways to help restore sort of some of the historic mangrove systems across the territory. Because obviously, as Dijani pointed out in his presentation, these capture a lot of the sediments, just as wetland ponds and so forth do as well. So they go hand in hand. Ideally, we'd love to see both the ground cover and the mangroves restored, which would together would do an amazing job of functioning as filtering what enters the marine environment. But I can't, it's hard to pick one over the other, though I suspect because of the land use, whether it's trails or development, because of such steep terrain in St. John, the erosion issue, protecting our uplands, forests and so forth, I think is quite important. As I don't think our mangroves can handle, even if they were restored to some previous state, would be adequate for filtering the water. That's just one opinion. Sharon and then Elaine.
Yes, Kim, I think you said that very well. I totally echo your sentiments there on the priorities. And I would say in the Coral Bay context, we really do need to consider the protection of existing dry wetlands as well as the mangroves, and wetlands that have been messed up over time by human filling and by sedimentation. And in an ideal world, we would return those to their use as wetlands at the mouth of the bay, as nature intended. This conflicts with a lot of other development ideas and so forth that's going on, including views, because the mangroves and so forth do block the view of the water. So but I think that we need to really work on mandating that we protect the wetland areas and restore them, and think about doing infrastructure restoration and new developments that is further away from the coastline.
All right. Elaine.
Hi, everybody. This is a great conference. I'm sorry I didn't realize Rafe was leaving, because I did have a question for him. But with regards to this question, I think because we are an island, obviously we're surrounded by water, and it's remarkable. In the 2 years that we've been here, I've been amazed at how diverse every little corner and every little inlet and every little point St. John is. And the interface between the water and the land is critical for everything that we do. And there isn't any one size fits all solution. It can't, we need to do the mangroves where mangroves make sense. We need to do wetlands where wetlands make sense. In Cruz Bay and Coral Bay, where the built environment meets the water, we need to do what is appropriate there, whether it's creating inlets that trap garbage and that can be easily cleaned out so it doesn't get funneled into the bays in those locations, trapping pollutions, making sure we don't have sewage overflows in the Cruz Bay area, which happens periodically. You know, how can we treat whatever the solution, find whatever the right solution is, reinforcing our shorelines where they're eroding, where it's necessary, you know, find the right solution for the right place. And it might be a simple planting. It might be an augmented hardened structure that is a hybrid between plants and you know, reinforced rocks and gabions and those kinds of things. In other areas, it might make sense for a hardened seawall. There isn't any one solution for any one place in St. John. We just need to be creative and willing and devote the resources to make a better long-term solution, including upland development regulations and planning. And I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you. I don't see any other questions. If you do, go ahead, throw them in the chat box, but I think we want to turn it over to Dijani to talk about community engagement. Or correct me if I'm wrong. Here we go.
So for the community engagement discussion, our objective with these questions are simply to just identify some ways that the community on St. John, whether it be in Coral Bay, Cruz Bay, or other places around the island, can help to basically contribute to the development of mitigation strategies and decisions that our decision makers in government and other areas make. So let's move to our first question. What obstacles keep individuals or communities from being involved in decisions that affect our ecosystems? It would be nice if you could answer with 3 words or phrases. So I see our first set of responses have come in, cultural differences. And now the next set of responses have moved everything around. But I see management, lack of information, and it's good. A lot of responses are coming in now. Some of the responses so far, such as lack of information and lack of education and management and local government, and also poor communication, are some of the similar responses that we saw yesterday in our St. Thomas workshop. It seems that the 2 islands, at least so far, have some of the same issues.
Well, I see money and big investors as something that we didn't see, or I don't remember seeing yesterday. I'd like to hear more about that. I mean, we know about the uber rich that are buying property, but I'd like to know how they impede, you know, local communities from getting involved. That would be a useful insight.
Well, I had said money, because it's kind of like a first order problem in a way. People that don't have access to a lot of money don't really have the time to really worry about issues like ecosystems because they're just worried about the day-to-day problems that they have and paying bills, and they don't really see, things not much beyond that.
Okay, well, no, that helps. I just saw them side by side. I was thinking, oh, well, maybe someone put them in together. Anyway, we've got some raised hands. I don't know if Sharon, you raised your hand, or is this a?
Yes, yes,
Okay, go ahead.
I did.
Go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of I think in Coral Bay, we have a lot. We have a Coral Bay Community Council, a community agency with 400 members and who are residents or property owners. We have an email list of 900 people. We are able to keep people informed. We are able to invite people to participate in activities and things. Pre-COVID, COVID has really put a big block in a lot of this. But what we have found over the last 20 years and previously is that the decision-making is made principally by St. Thomas and by big money in terms of things that matter. So it's not, and for all of St. John, dollars, Cruise Bay has had worse problems with this than Coral Bay, frankly, if you look at experiences over time. So let me speak for them. The frustrations involved in having both the Siranusa development and the Grand Bay development in Cruise Bay was a prime example of the reaction of the interest and reactions of the local community on St. John, saying in public meetings, no, no, and no. And the St. Thomas interest saying, we're going to make money off this, we don't care. And that continues on. So Coral Bay is no different from that. If you look at the histories of the government permitting processes and so forth, the bigger the investor, the bigger the perception of the investor, the more likely it is that the government and the various powers that be behind the government will try to make it happen. Therefore disenfranchising the communities.
All right, I thought there was another hand. Let's see if I can find it. Thought there was someone, speak up, whoever had their hand up earlier. Right? Oh, Kimiko, I think it was Kimiko.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe she took her hand down, but she's muted, so I don't know if she's.
Oh yeah, sorry, hi, thank you. Yeah, I was speaking to an earlier conversation.
Okay.
I had my earlier conversation.
I'm sorry, I missed it. All right, so no particular reaction here. Let's turn it back over to.
I do, just from like my perspective, just working with UVI and waste management and DPNR, on various sustainable materials management issues. I think certainly those agencies are with this SMM webinar series, we're trying to get more community engagement in terms of solutions and crowdsourcing the solutions to the issues. So I definitely recommend having a look at those. And if you have additional thoughts on that, we're going to be continuing a webinar series probably quarterly, and we're working with waste management and DPNR in terms of looking through all the data from and the suggestions from those webinars and how they can be incorporated to the overarching sustainable materials management plan.
Okay, well, I think, as we look at tools to engage the public. I mean, it sounds like your webinars and crowdsourcing is a great way to engage people, that especially younger folks who may be more either familiar or comfortable with the technology or that approach. But anyway, I want to get back to Dijani to make sure that we have 15 more minutes. If he has more questions, here we go.
Oh, thank you, Sharon and Kimiko, for your input. Let's move on to the next question. So how can people get more involved in decisions concerning the USVI ecosystem and their well-being? Again, you could answer with 3 words or phrases. With those first 3 responses are pretty passionate and powerful responses so far. Band together with yourself and speak out. All right, so we've had 5 respondents so far. Up to 6. So we'll just wait for a few more responses to trickle in, and then we'll move to the next question. It looks like we're capped at 6 respondents so far, so let's move on. Now our third question. Are there any success stories concerning local ecosystems where community engagement resulted in positive change? Please type your response. And also feel free, if anybody is willing, to explain some of your responses that you may put. So far, cleaning up of mangroves seems to be one of the ones that have come through. So beach cleanups, blocking of the summers and marina, and watershed management agencies. Some of the other responses we've seen so far. Now we'll just wait a little while longer to see if any more responses come in, and then we'll move to our final question. All right, let's move on to our final question. In 3 words, how do you usually get your news or information about decisions that affect USVI ecosystems? So I've seen newspapers come up a few times, social media, attending permit meetings, emails from the government, University of the Virgin Islands. So it seems like local newspapers are a big standout. How people get their information on St. John.
That was your last question, right, Dijani?
Yes, this is the final question.
Okay.
So I'll just wait for FS to see if you have any more responses, and then
Okay.
we'll move on. So that seems to be the last of responses. So thank you everyone for responding.
All right. Thank you, Dijani, and thank you everyone for participating in these surveys. I think this, you know, in lieu of an in-person meeting where we can have breakout groups or just raise your hand and really, you know, have engaged discussions, you know, the virtual meeting like this, I think the survey questions gives people a chance to articulate. It's not a perfect system, but it works. And just thinking about what we saw yesterday from folks here on St. Thomas, and then the contrast and similarities with folks on St. John or who are thinking about St. John, I think it's been really helpful both to distinguish the nature of the challenges as well as the opportunities. And you know, this issue of communication, you know, how we get information to people, how do we frame it in, you know, whether it's in socially or culturally relevant ways so that they feel like they're a part of the discussion, things like that. That's really difficult, and yet is worth our attention and our effort, because if, you know, if we really do want to see a groundswell of support for whether it's protecting the environment and our natural resources or any other issue, frankly, you know, we have to be inclusive both in our intent and in our efforts to reach broad audiences with a lot of different perspectives and backgrounds. So this again was quite helpful. On behalf of the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience team, I want to thank you for your time today, because again, all of us are busy, and yet, you know, what Texas A&M is doing with in support of our project here is important, and they've tried and developed these tools and used them elsewhere. And so I think they will be coming back to us with a really useful report. And some of that content will definitely end up in in the plan itself. Other parts of the report, other parts of the information that they share with us will be available online in a different, whether it's in a data repository or in the appendices for our online website once it's up and running. But again, on behalf of everyone here at UVI, thank you for your time and your participation. And if there's any, I want to make sure whether it's David or Greg or someone else wants to, any closing remarks. And I obviously also want to thank Rafe and for providing his comments earlier. I wish he had been able to stay with us, but thank you, Rafe and Sharon and others who contributed a lot of our content today.
Yeah, no, just thanks, Kim, for guiding us through today, and I appreciate the feedback from everybody in the discussion. Very helpful.
All right. Well, on that note, it is 11:59, and this concludes our meeting with folks on St. John and focusing on St. John. if you're interested, we will be doing this on St. Croix on Friday at the same time, 9 to noon. So be sure to go to the same spot where you registered for this meeting. If you want to listen in or participate in that meeting on Friday, we'll be doing a variation of the same discussion. Thanks again, everyone.